You've definitely heard the joke, right? The philosophy major graduates and asks, "You want fries with that?" It's a classic line, sure, but it completely misses the point. Today, we're going to dig into how asking life's biggest questions can actually lead to some of the most valuable skills in the entire modern workforce. So let's just tackle this stereotype head on. The myth is that philosophy is this useless degree, a fast track to a dead-end job. But when you look at the actual data, it tells a totally different story. We're talking about grads who outperform business majors on standardized tests and pull in salaries that are right up there with engineers. Yeah, the reality is way more interesting than the joke. And hey, the proof is right there in the numbers. If you look at the official GRE data, philosophy majors consistently score near the very top in verbal reasoning and analytical writing. And this is not an accident. Think about it. Their entire degree is a training ground for the exact skills these tests measure: clear logic, sharp reasoning, and powerful critical analysis. Okay, so that leads to the first big question. Does all that analytical skill actually translate into a good paycheck? We're calling this the philosophy payoff. Because, it's not just about acing a test, it's about what happens when those skills hit the real-world job market. Get this, $85,100. That's the median mid-career salary for philosophy majors. That puts them right alongside folks with degrees in civil engineering and computer science. So why? Well, it's because employers are more than willing to pay for what they've learned: how to solve incredibly complex problems, communicate with clarity, and see the big picture. But what are those skills, really? And how does philosophy even teach them? To really get how philosophy builds these skills, we have to go back to the very beginning. The training starts with one of the most fundamental human questions of all. What is morality anyway? It's all about learning not just what to think, but how to think about what's right and what's wrong. To put it simply, morality is kind of like the operating system we use to navigate our lives. It's the set of rules that tells us what's good and what's bad. Now, most of us just learn the rules and follow them. Philosophy, though, it trains you to look at the source code, to question why those rules are there in the first place, and to ask if maybe, just maybe, they could be written better. And this leads us to a really crucial distinction. On one side, you've got conventional morality. That's the set of rules we inherit from our society. It's basically what's popular. But on the other side, there's critical morality, which is about using logic and reason to step back and actually evaluate those rules. It's the difference between just following the map you were given and being able to draw a much better one for yourself. So how do you actually evaluate those rules, or any idea for that matter? Well, you need a system. This brings us to our next tool, the rules of reasoning. This is where philosophy hands you the blueprint for building absolutely bulletproof arguments and for taking down the weak ones. See, a philosophical argument isn't just someone's opinion. It's more like a machine built from pure logic. And the best kind is what we call a sound argument. This means two things. First, the logic has to work. The conclusion has to follow from the premises. And second, the premises themselves, the building blocks, have to be true. If you get both of those right, your conclusion is basically undeniable. But just as important as building good arguments is learning how to spot the bad ones. And we see bad reasoning all over the place, from boardrooms to political ads. For instance, I'm pretty sure you've heard something like this before. This classic mistake has a name: the ad hominem fallacy. It's a total cheap shot. You're attacking the person instead of engaging with their idea. Once you learn to spot these logical shortcuts, you become incredibly good at cutting through all the noise in any discussion and focusing on what actually matters: the argument itself. Okay, so once you've got the tools for solid reasoning, you can start building much bigger things. This is where we go from looking at individual arguments to entire systems for making decisions. We're going to look at two paths to good, two major frameworks for thinking through really complex problems. So at a really high level, you have two very different ways to decide what's right. Consequentialism is all about the outcome. The ends can justify the means. In contrast, natural law theory says that some actions are just right or wrong by their very nature, no matter what happens as a result. You can think of it as results-based thinking versus rule-based thinking. This framework really shows the methodical, almost scientific approach of consequentialism. It's a super clear 5-step process that honestly looks a lot like a business plan. You define your goals, you weigh the pros and cons, you analyze all your options, and then you pick the one with the highest ROI. In this case, the greatest net good. It's a really powerful tool for making strategic choices. But, that purely mathematical approach raises a really tough question. What if the consequences aren't the only thing that matters?
What if some actions are just off limits, no matter how good the outcome might be? This very question is the starting point for our second major framework. Natural law theory offers a completely different anchor for morality. The core idea here is that humans have a specific nature, a way we're meant to function, kind of like how a heart is meant to pump blood. So, from this point of view, moral actions are the ones that help us fulfill our human nature, while immoral actions work against it. Morality isn't some calculation, it's about living in harmony with our own design. So, after all this, looking at morality, reasoning, these big ethical frameworks, what's the final payoff? Well, you don't walk away with a list of easy answers. You leave with something much better, a super versatile mental toolkit that you can apply to pretty much any challenge you'll ever face. This is it. This is your philosophical toolkit. It's the ability to critically analyze any idea that comes your way. It's the logical rigor to build rock-solid arguments and spot weak ones in an instant. And it's the framework thinking that lets you approach a single problem from multiple angles before choosing the best path forward. These are the big picture skills that employers are really paying for. But in the end, it's not really about the paycheck. It's about being equipped to handle complexity. So while the old joke is about asking if someone wants fries, the reality is about learning how to ask the big, important questions that nobody else is even thinking to ask. Philosophy doesn't give you the answers, but it gives you something so much better, the tools to find your own.
All right, let's talk about something. The philosophy degree. When you hear those words, what's the first image that pops into your head? For a lot of people, it's basically the punchline to a joke about unemployment, right? But what if I told you that's one of the most outdated and frankly, just plain wrong ideas out there? Let's get into the surprising truth.
So yeah, this is the story you always hear. It's the old school way of thinking. Oh, you studied philosophy? So what coffee shop are you going to work at? The belief is that these majors are just totally unprepared for the real world, that their skills are useless in our tech-driven economy. This is the myth we're about to bust, piece by piece.
Because, opinions are one thing, but the data tells a very different story. And trust me, it's probably not what you're expecting.
Okay, check this out. This gets right to the heart of their analytical power. We're looking at the GRE here. That's the big test for getting into grad school. And philosophy majors don't just do well, they kind of dominate. They score higher than every other major in verbal reasoning and analytical writing. Think about that. This isn't about memorizing stuff. It's a raw measure of their ability to think, to reason, and to argue a point with incredible clarity.
And all that brain power, it translates directly into earning power. Just look at these mid-career salaries. Philosophy majors are pulling in $85,000 a year, right on par with political science majors. And look, they're basically neck and neck with civil engineers. So much for that starving philosopher stereotype, huh?
But it's not just where they end up that's impressive. It's how fast they get there. Get this, philosophy majors see a 101% salary increase from when they start their careers to the midpoint. 101%. That massive jump puts them in the top 15% of all majors for salary growth. So they're not just getting jobs, they're building careers that take off like a rocket.
And that really is the million-dollar question, isn't it? If they're not learning a specific trade, like how to code or do accounting, what is their secret sauce? What makes them so valuable? Well, the answer isn't about what they're taught to think, but how.
It all comes down to the mental toolkit they spend years building. Philosophy doesn't just give you the answer to one problem. It teaches you how to think through any problem, no matter how new or messy it is.
And it all starts with the basics. So when a philosopher talks about an argument, they're not talking about a shouting match. An argument is a precise, carefully built chain of thought. It's the fundamental building block. You learn to spot the reasons, the premises, and then figure out if they actually, logically lead to the conclusion. It's like learning the architecture of clear thinking itself.
And this is where the real training kicks in. You spend years learning to spot the difference between a good, solid, valid argument and a bad one that just sounds convincing. Being able to tell the difference between solid logic and a clever fallacy, in business, in law, in just about any important field, that's a superpower.
Let's make this even more real. When a philosopher faces a tough ethical problem, they don't just go with their gut. They have a process. First, they separate what's popular, what everyone else thinks, from what actually holds up under pressure. They nail down their starting assumptions. Then, they look at the problem from all these different angles, like, okay, what are the actual consequences here? And only then do they use all that training and logic to build a solid case for a conclusion. It's a structured system for navigating the gray areas of life.
And this quote, this really just nails the entire mindset.
Philosophy teaches you to press pause on the default settings, to look past what everyone says is true and ask, but is it? Does this idea actually make sense?
So at the end of the day, that's what this whole degree is. It's an intense workout for your brain. It's like CrossFit for your mind, building the strength to take any complicated, tangled-up problem, find its core, and map out a clear, logical path forward.
Okay, so how does all this brain training actually cash out in the real world? Let's connect that abstract toolkit to actual careers, where this kind of thinking isn't just a nice-to-have, it's in an incredibly high demand. So what are these skills in action? Well, it's the ability to look at a super messy problem and find the signal in the noise. It's reasoning with disciplined logic, not just emotion. It's having a framework for hard ethical calls and being able to communicate your ideas clearly and persuasively. And maybe the biggest one of all, it's the habit of questioning the basic assumptions everyone else takes for granted.
So where do you find people with these skills? The short answer is everywhere that matters. In the high-stakes worlds of consulting and finance, in law, medicine, and government. You find them as innovators in Silicon Valley and as top-tier journalists. And, maybe not so surprisingly, you find a whole lot of them as company founders and CEOs. They're literally paid to think. And this isn't just me saying this. This is what you hear from employers. They can find specialists. What's rare and what's so incredibly valuable is someone who can see the whole board. The person who understands the big picture and can navigate the human side of a problem, not just the technical side.
Which brings us right back to where we started. After looking at the test scores, the salaries, the career growth, and the powerful mental toolkit they build, we have to ask that question one more time. And I think the answer is pretty clear. In a world that's just getting more complicated, more uncertain, and more in need of clear, ethical thinking, a degree that teaches you how to think isn't just practical. It might just be the ultimate competitive advantage.
Welcome to the deep dive. You, the learner, sent us a really challenging stack of sources today. They're all centered on moral philosophy, a field that, let's be honest, often gets dismissed as, abstract and maybe even a bit useless in the real world.
That's the common perception, definitely.
So our mission today is pretty clear. First, we want to tackle those old myths about philosophy's practical value. And maybe more importantly, we're going to try and give you the actual intellectual toolkit.
Yeah, the concepts, the logic, the basic arguments.
Exactly. The stuff philosophers actually use to test claims about, well, what makes a good life? And what makes an action the right one?
Right. And I think these sources show two really crucial things. One is the concrete evidence, the surprisingly strong career success of people trained in philosophy. And second, the kind of systematic logic you actually need to have a real ethical debate.
Moving beyond just opinions, basically.
Exactly. Towards building, sound arguments.
Okay, let's dive in then with that first point, because it really does flip the script. The unexpected value of getting a philosophy degree. I think many of us grew up hearing, what are you going to do with that? That they're unemployable, no marketable skills.
Useless in a tech world, yeah.
Totally useless in a tech-driven global economy, just destined for low salaries.
Well, the data we looked at just flat out contradicts that old way of thinking.
Yeah.
It's quite striking, actually. When you look at philosophy grads, the BA level, their unemployment rate, it's reported at 4.3%.
4.3, that's pretty low.
It's lower than the overall national average. And, maybe more surprisingly, it's lower than a lot of majors people think of as safe, like biology, chemistry, even economics.
Wow, okay. And then there's the performance aspect, like how they do on standardized tests.
Oh yeah, the GRE scores. This is fascinating. Philosophy majors score higher than all other majors on verbal reasoning and analytical writing.
All of it.
Yes. We're talking scores significantly above the average. It shows this incredible ability to handle complex information, see the structure, articulate arguments really precisely.
And that is the skill, isn't it? That's what employers say they need. Critical thinking, clear communication.
Absolutely. And it translates into money, too. The median mid-career salary, around $85,100.
$85,000. That's definitely not the starving philosopher stereotype.
Not at all. It's competitive with many STEM fields, actually near the top for liberal arts majors. The sources specifically point out it's higher than chemical engineering, graphic design, even mathematics graduates mid-career.
Higher than math. Okay,
Yeah.
That's genuinely surprising.
And if they stay in their careers 10 years or more, that median salary bumps up again closer to $93,000.
Staggering numbers, really. So where are they working? It's not all academia, clearly.
No, far from it. They end up on Wall Street, in government roles, Silicon Valley, often as innovators, thinking outside the box. And they're heavily represented in top graduate programs, law school, medical school. The sources stress that philosophical training is seen as like essential prep for those fields.
Why? What's the connection to law or medicine?
It's that core skill again, advanced critical thinking. It's not job training. It's training how to think rigorously, how to analyze arguments, spot flaws, define terms clearly.
Okay, finding flaws, defining nebulous terms, putting different views together.
Exactly, the skills you need at the highest levels, whatever the industry. Which brings us nicely to how they get that skill set. We need to unpack the toolkit itself.
Right, the foundations of moral philosophy.
Let's start with a necessary admission, maybe a slightly uncomfortable one.
Which is?
There isn't one single, universally agreed upon definition of morality. It's tricky. We really only get a handle on it by making distinctions.
Okay, so what's the first big distinction?
It's fundamental. Conventional morality versus critical morality.
Conventional, like what's normally accepted.
Exactly. It's the system of rules, often just inherited, that are widely accepted within a particular culture or society. Think about tipping customs. Huge difference between the U.S. and Japan, right?
Right. Or social norms, like comparing, say, Denmark and Saudi Arabia on certain issues. Very different conventions.
Precisely. That's conventional morality. But then you have critical morality.
And that's where the philosophy really comes in.
Yes. This is about moral standards that are meant to be independent of whether they're popular or widely endorsed. They're the standards we use to evaluate conventional morality. To ask, is this tradition, this law, this accepted practice actually right? Is it justified?
So it's the tool for judging the rules we live by.
That's a good way to put it. And to organize that judging process, the field usually breaks down into three main branches.
Okay, what are they?
First, there's value theory. This asks, what is the good life? What's intrinsically worth pursuing for its own sake? Happiness, well-being, something else.
What's ultimately valuable?
Got it.
Second, normative ethics. This focuses on our fundamental moral duties. What makes an action right or wrong? Do the ends justify the means? What character traits are virtues? That sort of thing.
The rules of conduct, basically.
More or less. And third, there's metaphysics. This is the most abstract level. It questions the status of moral claims themselves.
Like, can moral statements even be true, or are they just opinions?
Exactly. How do we gain moral knowledge? Can morality be objective? Big foundational questions.
Okay. But before we dive into specific theories in those branches, what about skepticism? The idea that all this moral talk is just, dressing up our biases.
That's a common critique. But the sources argue philosophy doesn't start in a vacuum. It builds on what they call plausible moral starting points. These are like bedrock ethical assumptions that most people find intuitive, that we can generally agree on to get the conversation started.
Okay, give me some examples.
Sure. Like the idea that neither law nor tradition is immune from moral criticism. Just because something is law doesn't make it right.
Makes sense. Or that everyone is morally fallible. We all make mistakes. Nobody's perfect.
Okay.
That deliberately hurting others needs justification. The default is do no harm.
Right. You need a good reason.
That justice is a really important moral good. And, maybe the most basic, that agony, intense suffering is bad.
These seem like pretty reasonable starting points. Hard to argue against them.
Right. They provide common ground. And one more thing to clarify before we get into logic. What morality isn't? We need to contrast it with other things we often confuse it with.
Good idea. Like what?
Well, law, for one. They overlap, but they are the same. Cheating on your spouse might be immoral, but it's usually not illegal.
And criticizing a dictator might be illegal in some places, but you could argue it's morally right.
Exactly. It's also distinct from etiquette. Using the wrong fork at dinner. Bad manners, maybe. Not usually immoral.
Okay.
It's different from pure self-interest. Morality sometimes asks us to sacrifice our own interests. Think of whistleblowers who risk everything.
Right. That's clearly not self-interested.
And crucially, it's separate from tradition. Just because a practice has been around for a long time, think of slavery or historical oppression, that longevity doesn't automatically make it moral. Tradition needs justification too.
Okay, that sets the stage nicely. So now, the logic part. The skill behind those GRE scores.
Yes, the logic of moral reasoning. This is the analytical core. If we want our moral conclusions to hold water, we need strong arguments. An argument is just, well, reasons, premises, offered to support a conclusion.
And the goal isn't just any argument, it's a good one.
The gold standard is a sound argument. That means two things have to be true. First, it has to be logically valid.
Okay, what does valid mean here technically?
The validity is purely about the structure, the form of the argument. It means if the premises were true, the conclusion must also be true. The connection is watertight.
Even if the premises are actually nonsense.
Even then, validity is just about the logical link. For an argument to be sound, it must be valid and all its premises must actually be true in the real world. Soundness equals validity plus true premises.
Got it. So validity is the foundation. Why focus on these specific forms, like modus ponens?
Because these valid forms are like the blueprints for good reasoning. They guarantee that if your starting points are right, your conclusion follows logically. They're the tests we apply to ethical claims.
Okay, so let's break down modus ponens, the affirming mode.
Right. The structure is, if P, then QP is true. Therefore, Q must be true. Think of P as a sufficient condition. If P happens, it's enough to guarantee Q happens.
Like, if it's ice, P, then it's frozen Q. It is ice.
Therefore, it must be frozen Q. Guaranteed.
Simple enough. What about the opposite modus tollens, the denying mode?
The structure here is, if P, then Q. Q is not true, not Q. Therefore, P must also be not true, not P. In this case, Q is a necessary condition for P. You absolutely need Q to be true if P is going to be true.
Example.
Let's see. If you are a living mammal, P, then you have lungs. Q. This creature does not have lungs, not Q. Therefore, it cannot be a living mammal, not P. The absence of the necessary condition Q forces us to deny P.
Okay, those seem straightforward when you lay them out, but people mess these up.
All the time.
Yeah.
That leads to formal fallacies, mistakes purely in the logical structure. A really common one is denying the antecedent.
Denying the if part.
Exactly. The form is, if P, then Q, not P, therefore not Q. This looks similar to modus tollens, but it's invalid.
Why?
Because P might be sufficient for Q, but it might not be necessary. There could be other ways for Q to be true.
Okay, need an example here.
Sure. If I'm a millionaire, P, then I have $10. Q.
That's true, right?
Yeah, I suppose.
Now, suppose I am not a millionaire, not P. Can you conclude, therefore, I do not have $10, not Q?
No, of course not. I could have $20 or $50 or just $10.
Exactly. Being a millionaire is sufficient to have $10, but it's not necessary. So denying P doesn't let you deny Q. That's the fallacy.
Okay, I see it. And the other common one?
Affirming the consequent. This one flips modus ponens incorrectly. The form is, if P, then Q is true, therefore P must be true.
Let's use a millionaire example again.
Yeah.
If I'm a millionaire, P, I have $10 Q. I do have $10 Q. Therefore, I must be a millionaire.
P, definitely not. Having $10 is necessary if you're a millionaire, but it's certainly not sufficient. Loads of people have $10 who aren't millionaires.
Precisely. Q being true doesn't guarantee P is true. Another fallacy. Spotting these flawed structures is a huge part of philosophical training.
And this isn't just about structure, right? There are other kinds of bad arguments.
Right. Those are informal fallacies. The problem isn't the logical form. It's something about the content or the way the argument is presented.
Like attacking the person.
Yeah, the classic ad hominem. Attacking the person making the argument instead of the argument itself. Someone might be a hypocrite, but their argument about, say, the importance of honesty could still be perfectly sound.
Makes sense. What else?
The straw man fallacy is another big one. That's where you misrepresent your opponent's position, make it weaker or sillier than it actually is, and then attack that distorted version.
Easier to knock down a straw man than a real one.
Exactly. And then there's just appealing to irrelevant emotions, using fear, pity, anger, whatever, instead of providing actual reasons and evidence, using manipulation instead of logic.
Okay, so we have the toolkit, the branches of moral philosophy, the starting points, the logic, the fallacies. Now let's actually apply it, starting with value theory.
Right. What makes a life good? What has intrinsic value? Remember, that's value for its own sake, not just as a tool or means to something else.
Like money is usually just instrumental, right?
Yeah.
Valuable for what it buys.
Exactly. So what, if anything, is intrinsically valuable? The simplest, maybe oldest answer is hedonism.
Pleasure is the key.
Pretty much. The core claim is that happiness defined basically as pleasure and the absence of pain is the only thing that is intrinsically good. Everything else is good only insofar as it brings happiness.
What's the appeal? It sounds a bit simple.
Well, it seems to explain why so many different kinds of lives can be good ones. People find pleasure in vastly different things. It gives personal authority. Your happiness matters for your life. And it seems intuitively plausible. Who argues that pleasure is bad in itself?
True. But surely there are criticisms.
Oh, absolutely. One classic is the argument from evil pleasures. What about the happiness a sadist gets from hurting someone? Is that happiness intrinsically good for the sadist, even if the act is morally horrific?
Oof. What do hedonists say?
They usually bite the bullet and say, yes, the happiness itself is still a benefit to the person experiencing it, even if it comes from a morally depraved source. They separate the value for the person from the moral value of the action.
Okay. Tricky. What else?
A really powerful one comes from Robert Nozick's thought experiment, the experience machine.
I think I've heard of this. The Matrix, basically.
Sort of, yeah. Imagine a machine you can plug into for life. It perfectly simulates any reality you desire, giving you maximum pleasure and happiness. You wouldn't know it's not real. The question is, would you plug in, knowing it's a simulation? A consistent hedonist seems committed to saying yes, it guarantees maximum happiness, the sole intrinsic good.
But most people say no, don't they? I think I would.
Exactly. Most people hesitate or refuse. Why? If happiness is the only thing that matters, why prefer a real life with potential pain and failure over guaranteed simulated bliss?
It feels like something else is missing, like authenticity, real achievement, making actual choices.
Precisely. If you reject the machine, you're implicitly saying that something besides happiness must be intrinsically valuable, maybe truth or contact with reality, or maybe autonomy, the ability to actually live your own life, make your own choices, even if those choices don't always maximize pleasure.
We value being the authors of our own lives, even if the story isn't always happy.
That seems to be the intuition, and hedonism struggles to account for that.
So what's the main alternative if hedonism has problems?
A major contender is the desire satisfaction theory.
Getting what you want.
Basically, yes. Your life goes well to the extent that your desires are satisfied. The intrinsic good is having your desires fulfilled.
Okay, the appeal here seems obvious. It respects individual differences. What you want makes your life good. It avoids imposing some objective list of good things.
Exactly. It gives each person the final say. But like hedonism, it runs into problems.
Let me guess. Problematic desires.
You got it. First, we probably have to limit it to informed desires. If you desire something based on a total misunderstanding or false belief, getting it might not actually make your life better.
Okay, makes sense. You need to know what you're really wanting.
But even with informed desires, what about desires that seem, well, impoverished or unhealthy? Imagine someone who, maybe due to oppression or low self-esteem, only desires very minimal things.
Like the example in the source, the person whose only desire is to count blades of grass all day.
Right. Or maybe a slave whose only desire, perhaps informed, is simply to serve their master well. If they succeed in fulfilling these very limited desires, does this theory force us to say they are living a truly good life?
That feels wrong. Deeply wrong. It seems like a good life needs more than just getting whatever you happen to want, especially if what you want is stunted.
That's the intuition. It suggests that maybe there are some objective goods, some baseline requirements for human flourishing that go beyond just subjective desire satisfaction.
Okay, so value theory is complicated. What about normative ethics theories about right and wrong action?
Let's start with one of the oldest approaches, natural law theory.
Based on human nature.
Yes. The core idea is that actions are right if they are natural, meaning they align with or fulfill our fundamental human nature, and wrong if they are unnatural.
How do we define human nature? Isn't that the immediate problem? Is it just what's innate, or what we all share? Or does it imply a specific purpose?
That is the central challenge, absolutely. Different versions define nature differently. Some focus on innate tendencies, others on shared capacities like reason, others on a purpose like survival and reproduction. It gets complex fast.
How does it work in practice then?
Often it relies on supplementary principles. One famous one is the doctrine of double effect, or DDE.
Double effect. Sounds technical.
It is a bit. It's a way to judge actions that have both a good outcome and a harmful side effect. DDE says it can be permissible to cause harm if that harm is merely a foreseen side effect of achieving a good goal and not the intended means or end itself.
Okay, the intention is the key thing.
Exactly. So the classic example, a doctor giving high doses of morphine to ease a terminally ill patient's pain. Good intention. Even foreseeing it might slightly hasten death. Bad side effect. DDE might permit this.
But if the doctor intended to hasten death by giving the morphine, that would be impermissible, even with the same outcome.
Under DDE, yes. The intention behind the foreseen harm matters critically. Distinguishing intent from mere foresight in complex cases is, well, philosophically difficult work.
Okay. What's a contrasting view to natural law?
A major one is consequentialism. This approach ignores intentions and naturalness and focuses purely on the results, the consequences of actions.
All about the outcomes.
Pretty much. The most famous version is ACT utilitarianism.
Utility, like usefulness.
In a sense, it's governed by the principle of utility. An action is morally right, in fact required, if and only if it produces the greatest net balance of good over bad, considering everyone affected.
Good over bad, usually meaning happiness over suffering.
Typically, yes. The ultimate goal is maximizing overall well-being or happiness in the world. And a key feature here is strict impartiality.
Impartiality, meaning
Everyone's happiness or suffering counts equally. Your own happiness doesn't count more than a stranger's. Doesn't matter about race, gender, wealth, nationality. Everyone's well-being gets factored into the calculation equally.
even animals.
If they can suffer, yes. A consistent utilitarian would say their suffering matters in the overall calculation too, because suffering is bad, regardless of who experiences it.
That sounds demanding and potentially problematic. If you only look at the overall sum of happiness, what happens to individual rights? Justice.
You've hit on the core objection, the problem of injustice.
Does utilitarianism sometimes require unjust actions if they lead to the best overall outcome?
Yes, it seems it can. Utilitarianism, in its pure form, rejects absolute moral rules like never punish the innocent. Imagine a scenario where framing and punishing one innocent person could prevent riots and chaos that would harm hundreds of others.
Right.
If the calculation shows that punishing the one maximizes overall well-being.
Then the utilitarian has to say that's the morally required action. Punish the innocent.
According to strict ACT utilitarianism, yes. The end, the greatest overall good, justifies the means, even if the means involve injustice to an individual.
Wow, that's a really tough pill to swallow. It seems like it clashes fundamentally with our intuitions about basic rights and fairness.
It absolutely does. It sets up this major conflict in ethics. Do we prioritize maximizing overall good outcomes, or do we uphold certain inviolable duties and rights, even if doing so sometimes leads to worse overall consequences? That's the central tension.
Okay. We have covered a huge amount of ground here. We started by, well, kind of debunking the myth of the useless philosophy major.
Those salaries and GRE scores really tell a different story.
Definitely. Then we mapped out the territory of moral philosophy, the different branches, the basic starting points, the crucial role of logic.
Modus ponens, modus tollens, avoiding those fallacies.
Right, the whole analytical toolkit. And then we dove into the big questions. What makes a life good? Hedonism versus desire theory, the experience machine.
And what makes an action right? Natural law and the doctrine of double effect versus the cold calculations of utilitarianism.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. But I think the real takeaway isn't just memorizing the theories, it's understanding that toolkit, the logic, the concepts like validity and soundness, the named fallacies. That's the machinery needed to actually evaluate any claim rigorously, whether it's ethical, political, or anything else.
That's why the skill set is valuable?
Exactly. It's training critical thinking at a very high level.
So wrapping this up, we've seen how these ethical theories demand really precise, often demanding reasoning. Utilitarianism especially seems to require these, almost cold, hard calculations about well-being versus suffering. It leads to a final, maybe provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over. Given the kind of rigorous, sometimes counterintuitive logic required by these philosophical systems, does mastering this kind of analysis just make you a better, more skillful arguer? Or does digging this deep into ethics, into the logic of morality, inherently nudge you towards being a more moral person?
That's a deep question. Does understanding the logic change the person? Something to think about.